Welcome, everybody. Delighted to see such a nice audience for such a great talk. Professor Alexandra Stern is a member of the OB-GYN department here in the medical school, but her main affiliation is that she is chair of American culture. She wrote the award-winning book, Eugenic Nations, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in Modern America. She is also an affiliate in the Department of History, Department of Women's Studies, and director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. She has a number of awards. I'll just tell you about a couple of them. In 2006, she won the American Public Health Association Award for Outstanding Contributions to Scholarship on the History of Public Health for the Eugenic Nations book. She was recipient of the Emma Thornblatt Prize for the Best Article in the Indiana Magazine of History in 2007. 2012, she got the John McGovern Award in Family Health and Human Values from the University of Houston. And most recently, 2017, she had an annual lectureship award at Yale University. In addition to Eugenic Nations, her newest book is Telling Genes, the Story of Genetic Counseling in America. She is here today because of a chance encounter in the state of California that you will hear more about, and she's going to be talking about the question of historical justice for survivors of sterilization. Many of you know that the United States Supreme Court decided that it was legal to sterilize under certain conditions. That Supreme Court decision has never been overruled, although it is no longer in effect. As a result of that ruling, a number of states, including Michigan and California, engaged in sterilization processes without consent, and that's going to be what you're going to hear about today. Alex.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? In the back, very nice. Thank you, Ed, for that introduction. And also thank you, Dr. Reshma Jagsi, for the initial invitation, and Amy Lynn for coordinating this, and the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine for including me as part of your bioethics ground rounds this month. So let's start off in the here and now. Just last month, an assemblywoman in the state of California, Wendy Carrillo, introduced a bill to compensate survivors of sterilization under that state's eugenics program, which was in force from 1909 to 1979, as well as survivors of sterilization in state prisons that occurred later in the 2000s. The research that we have done here in my sterilization and social justice lab informs this bill to a great extent and is providing the evidence and actually the registry for the identification of individuals sterilized in California in the 20th century, such that there's actually a clause that I had to run by, this will be music to Ed's ears, run by General Counsel on Central Campus about the inclusion of our sterilization and social justice lab as a consultative service as part of the process that the Victims' Compensation Board will be using. So this is right now unfolding. It's being heard in various committees in the state of California. It's hopefully moving from public safety and the Assembly to the Senate and hopefully to the governor's desk where it will be signed and funded. There was a similar attempt last year, which made it to the very end of the process. I learned a lot about legislative processes. The bill made it through every single committee, and it was August, and that's kind of getting towards the end of the line. And then it just died in committee, and that's it. It's over. You have to start again. So our research provides the evidence that supports the advocacy efforts that are being undertaken in California with regards to sterilization compensation, something that I'm very supportive of, and I think that we can make a strong case for the need for redress and compensation. So, so does the Los Angeles Times. So I guess I'm in good company here. They published several editorials supporting the call for compensation. And also there is a precedent for this, which I think is important in thinking about the bioethical dimensions and the role of precedent, in that North Carolina, where about 7,600 people were sterilized in the 20th century under eugenics law, it launched a sterilization compensation program in 2014, which ran for 4 years and just ended last year. Virginia has an ongoing program. 8,000 people were sterilized there in state institutions. Their call is ongoing. They're still identifying people once they're verified. Usually the amount of compensation is in the range of about $25,000, and if there's enough left in the pool after the first phase process, there can be an additional distribution, but other folks might come forward as well. And then there's an interesting question: once the money runs out, if there are more victims, what happens? That hasn't been the case to date. So how does the historical research that I and others have done, and particularly that's centered here in my sterilization and social justice lab, how has that informed redress efforts? So I'm going to tell you a story that Ed alluded to about how I even came across the materials that allow us to build this registry and to understand this history, its demographic and qualitative and quantitative dimensions. So I wrote a book on the history of eugenics in California, which I published in 2005, and I recently updated in light of this new material in 2016. And one of the things that left me frustrated after I finished that book was I had learned so much about eugenics, particularly xenophobia and racism in California, and how eugenics was connected to that, how eugenics was connected to certain aspects of child and youth welfare. And I knew, obviously, that 20,000 people had been sterilized in the state of California, but I didn't know anything really about them. I knew about the law, I knew the general numbers, but I didn't know who these people were. I didn't know what pathways let them into the institution. I couldn't see into the walls of the institution. And I didn't know much at all about what were the legal and administrative dynamics of sterilization. So I decided, historians typically go to the archives, like our fantastic Bentley Historical Archives here, or the state archives. But sometimes when you want to find certain types of records, particularly records that are, let's talk about a case that's relevant here, sensitive health records from an agency, like a state health agency or welfare agency, sometimes, it's worth a shot to go to the agency itself. And that's what I did in 2007. I was in Sacramento, California, and I went to what was then called the California Department of Mental Health. It since was renamed the California Department of State Hospitals. And I was ready to do an expedited IRB. I mean, I had everything set up, because another researcher I know had told me at some point he had heard that there were sterilization forms and records that were held in this agency. And basically, I could tell you the super long version of this, which is kind of interesting and circuitous, but I don't have time for that. So the upshot of it is that I got really lucky, and I found 19 microfilm reels containing over 5,000 individual documents and documenting 20,000 sterilizations that occurred in California from 1919 to 1951, which was really the height of the era of California's sterilization program. This allowed me to expand my book, which I mentioned before, and to get inside the walls of these types of institutions, to understand the demographics, to understand the process of labeling and diagnosis that went on, and to compare institution to institution. This, as you know, sterilization was one part of eugenics programs across the United States and really across the world in the 20th century. Eugenics emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was a term that was coined by Sir Francis Galton, really meaning to be better bred or to engage in better breeding, to choose advantageous traits over disadvantageous traits. And you know what the tools that those who called themselves eugenicists had in the early 20th century were really kind of pretty basic tools of, pedigree charts and observational work. In genetics, a lot of it drawn from plants, some of it drawn from mammals, which often geneticists did not extrapolate, they did not hesitate to extrapolate from mice to humans. Or bunny rabbits or guinea pigs from humans. But based on that, eugenics ideas kind of bubbled up and became part of social reform movements. And really, this is an instance of using simplified and simplistic ideas from science to attempt to solve complex social problems. So eugenics has a lot of issues attached to it, but one of, just in a kind of broad sweep, it's really trying to fit, a square peg in a round hole and using, a huge hammer to hit a very small nail. The techniques used by and ideas used by eugenicists revolved around categories of fitness and unfitness, who could belong, who should be kept outside of the body politic. In order to do that, you have to classify, so intelligence testing, other forms of categorizing people according to race, according to a whole range of other traits, with the overall goal of improving the human stock. And this was all within a racialized kind of lens of white superiority. So, if you think about white nationalism and its reemergence today, many of the talking points of white nationalists today are not dissimilar from the talking points that you would find among some of the most well-known eugenicists of the early 20th century, such as Madison Grant or Charles Davenport and so on. So if you think of these eugenic kind of policies and practices on a spectrum, they actually went from things that today seem potentially even laudatory or comical, such as better babies contests or fitter family contests or incentives for white women in university to drop out and get married and have babies, the kind of more positive eugenics, all the way to things that would be on the more negative side of the spectrum. Obviously, at the farthest end of that, you get to euthanasia and mass euthanasia of certain populations based on race, ethnicity, and religion. So we obviously know about Nazi Germany and the role of racial hygiene in eugenics in the Third Reich. But not far from that, on the kind of negative spectrum, sits sterilization, which is the intentional state-sanctioned deprivation of someone's reproductive capacity based on a range of laws. We'll get more into the complexities of sterilization as a reproductive health choice later. So the United States was actually led the way in sterilization laws around the world. Indiana passed the first sterilization law in 1907, followed by Washington State, and then by California in 1909. These laws continued to be passed until 1937, with Georgia passing the final law in 1937, as well as the U.S. colony of Puerto Rico. And under those laws, over 60,000 people were sterilized. And this, it's kind of, if you think of it, 32 of 48 states, because Hawaii and Alaska were not yet states at the time this was happening, 2/3 of U.S. states had sterilization laws on the books. Now, some didn't use them very often. Some used, invoked them on a quite regular basis. But it gives you a sense of the swath. It's an also interesting question. Why did some states not pass sterilization laws? What were the barriers there? So California surpassed all the other states. And this has always been an intriguing question. Why? What was going on in California? What had allowed it to perform so many sterilizations? But it's still interesting to look at the other states, and you will see here the state that's in the fourth slot is actually Michigan, with about 4,000 sterilizations. So, Michigan, was a player in eugenic sterilization. So back to these records. So I found these records And, you probably have never, has anyone worked with microfilm? Okay, it's very painful. Do you agree? It makes you dizzy. It's hard to work with. It's hard to, how do you pull data from a microfilm reel that you're looking at in one of those machines where you're either saving PDFs or making copies? Well, we knew that in order to, and this is, I'm expanding the we to include a graduate student who was working with me at the time, who now is a professor in her own right at another institution, sorry that jumped back, as well as in consultation with two wonderful colleagues in the School of Public Health, Siobhan Harlow and Sharon Cardia. We began to realize that to actually, if we were going to capture data from these records, we needed to first digitize them and then create a data capture instrument so we could pull all of the variables out of them to do both quantitative and qualitative analysis and to understand demographic patterns as well as an array of experiential patterns. So we turned to Redcap, which luckily is something that is supported here at U of M. And it has some challenges, but it's worked very well because it is HIPAA protected. And so we knew we were on the ground floor putting the documents into a HIPAA protected system. And what we began to do, and when we first started, I thought, oh, this will take 6 months. Well, 3 years later, we finished pulling all of the data for California, and in the end we had over 20,000 records. We have 212 variables. It's a lot of interesting, for those who are interested in how you create instruments, this was a very challenging process because of all of the unique data points we had to pull out, and also the changing meaning of the terms that we were looking at, terms such as feeble-minded versus mental retardation, and decisions about whether to use historical, yes, offensive terms, or whether to update them, which erase some of that historical meaning, as offensive as it was. So we entered all of this into Redcap. These are the kinds of records that we were entering. Some of these must be redacted per California state law, and some of them don't have to be based on a kind of a time frame. So you'll see both in my presentation. But this gives you a sense of each of these forms. We pulled 212 variables out of these forms. Sometimes there were accompanying forms such as a surgical operation consent form or letters from family members or from social workers and so on. And you can see here that we're going to talk about consent. Here's a recommendation form. By the way, these are recommendation forms. They do not absolutely ensure that that person was sterilized, but we have other documents in the files that provide dates of sterilization. So we integrated those together. But if you see here, written consent was not given, and written consent given. Now, the law in California actually did not require consent. It arrogated a great deal of authority to the medical superintendents to carry out sterilizations based on their own judgment of the fitness of the individual. And they could easily override the parents, the guardian ad litems, anyone else who was in charge of someone who'd been named a ward of the state. However, even though it wasn't required, the medical superintendents and the Department of Mental Health/Hygiene required these forms and used these forms. A lot of this has to do with liability because they knew that others had been sued in different states, and just as a form of protection and maybe some, if you want to give them some credit, some sense of, ethical principles. However, the conditions under which these occurred were highly problematic and very hierarchical. So these are the forms that we entered. And then soon, I was able to get up and running the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab where we've been doing this work. And, it's been great that this started with funding from M3, and now we have an R01 from the NIH to do this work and expand it. And we have an extensive team which now spans 4 different institutions. I'll get into that more in a minute. One of the first things we published using these records was an estimate of likely number of living sterilization survivors. This was published in 2017. The estimate given was for 2016. And this was an interesting process of figuring out how to frame this article, it's very evidence-driven. However, it also makes a strong call for redress and for thinking about issues of justice and ethics in the contemporary moment. And this did get a lot of media attention, and it was picked up by the legislator who tried the attempt last year that was unsuccessful, which has been kind of relaunched this year with another assembly person in California. So we published this in AJPH, and we also provided for policymakers fine-grained breakdowns of the estimate of survivors. This looks at institution. There were 10 institutions that sterilized. You can see the highest number is from Sonoma, then Pacific Colony. That Sonoma sterilized over 5,000 people. It was a home for the quote-unquote feeble-minded. It was a very aggressive sterilizer. Each year, this number goes down by about 100. We have added to recent estimates some kind of less rigorous, but still the best that's available calculations for those sterilized between 1952 and 1979. But right now, we're looking at about approximately 550 people who we estimate would still be alive in 2019. This is the bill that was the attempt at the bill last year. Then we also published the following year in a continued effort to understand the demographics and the demographics and the dynamics around eugenic sterilization. We decided, I had, determined and written in my earlier book in narrative form, really there was a strong anti-Mexican bias in the sterilization program. You can see that from looking at the records, from looking at the descriptions, from looking at the ways in which Mexican families and youth were treated and the ways in which they were pathologized by eugenics. But we wanted to actually be able to show this. And this is where really, both this article and the other and subsequent work that we're doing, this work must be done as collaborative work with a team where I'm providing, I'm directing the lab, providing historical context and that knowledge, but I could not do it without the expertise of my colleagues in public health and those who actually know how to do things like run regressions and use life tables. And so we really have worked together to integrate that such that our current project really is pushing, I think, the bounds of mixed methods using both qualitative and quantitative analysis. So just a plug for everyone on my research team, and particularly Nicole Novak, who did her PhD in epidemiology here, who did the lion's share of work for this article, also published in the AJPH, where we actually were able to show, using the records, that women and girls were 14% more likely to be sterilized, male Latino patients were 23% more likely, and where you really see kind of the targeting aspect of sterilization come into play is in the last point, that female Latina patients were 59% more likely to be sterilized than non-Latina female patients. And that really centered more in the younger demographic. So, a 16-year-old Latina, and for Latino we used Hispanic surname based on U.S. Census record standards for using Hispanic surname. And we also had to use census records as a kind of control. I can talk more about that. But the bottom line is that this really shows the racial bias and the gender bias in the program and how that played out in California. And that, I would say, galvanized further the call for redress, because what you have is minority and vulnerable populations that were targeted and affected by this program and still living with its legacies today. This just gives you a sense of the rates and the disproportionality of the rates, so that you can see from non-Spanish surname male at the rate of 33 per 1,000 all the way to Spanish surname female at 186 if you estimate it up per 1,000. This confirmed research that I had done historically with a colleague, Natalie Lira, and published in a Latino Studies journal, and also that had actually been done by some economists who had looked at the state of North Carolina and found similar patterns vis-a-vis black women in the 50s and 60s in that state. So what are we doing when we capture and analyze this history of eugenic sterilization? We are doing a lot of work with the quantitative dimensions. around both estimates, around looking at issues of disproportionality and rates. We also are doing more and more with the qualitative dimension. So I am using this to write about the history of Sonoma, what went on there on a daily basis, how and why were people sent to the institution from, say, the juvenile court in San Francisco? How were they able to leave the institution? We're doing a lot of comparative work across states because we've expanded our project to include Iowa and North Carolina. We're looking across institutions. Okay, there's my, oh no, that's not mine. Okay, good, I have 10 more minutes. Thank you, that was a gift. I thought, wow, I have a long way to go. And then we're looking at categories of race, ethnicity, gender, age, diagnosis or label, a religion, level of education, or county, some of which has to be proxied through other variables. So when we look at income, we'll be looking at county, we'll be looking at level of education. One of the things that is very challenging about doing this work is that the sterilization laws that were passed in the United States never mentioned race or gender or ethnicity. What they mentioned were categories of disability and categories of, so-called deviance or defectiveness. So when you analyze them, what you need to do is, come up with tools for understanding how race, ethnicity, class, and other variables operated through the filters and the proxies of disability and these categories of unfitness. We are also doing a lot of work probing the meaning of consent and approval in institutional settings where hierarchy and paternalism reigned, in grand and extreme fashion. So it's kind of obvious, but I'll just state it, that the consent that was done as part of the eugenics sterilization programs, at least in the 4 states that I know best, I'll include Michigan in that as well, it doesn't meet today's threshold for voluntariness. So it's not even close. It's way down there on the scale. Connected to that, in several institutions, release was contingent upon sterilization. So that was the carrot that was wielded by the superintendents. And in many instances, decisions were not made in the best, in most instances, in the best interest of the patients. Now, some of the parents who brought their kids to these institutions believed that they were doing the right thing because that was in accordance with the mores of the time. In many instances, you have other players involved in determination. So there's one case where it's the truancy advisor from a public school who's bringing someone into the juvenile court and making a decision about sterilization. It's guardians, and it's also family members who, may not really have the best interests of the child at heart. For example, male family members, and there are a good number of instances of this, fathers or uncles who are sexually abusing the girls who end up going to institutions and so on. So we're really delving into this consent, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts on, how to apply, bioethical frameworks to thinking about consent and to thinking about it historically. And then we're also, with our work, tracing the longevity of sterilization laws and practices into the 1970s. So we're taking it across the long swath of the 20th century. This is when we, unpack this a little bit with some examples. So when thinking about, disability or unfitness as proxies or lenses through which other categories are filtered and become more pronounced and biases expressed, you can just look at these 4 categories. This was part of California's law. And these are the rationales that were given for sterilization. So mental disease, feeble-mindedness, perversion or marked departures from normal mentality, a lot of that had to do with sexual transgressiveness of, boys or young men who were, labeled as homosexual, may or may not have engaged in sodomy. Also, girls and young women who were having children out of wedlock or, were labeled as promiscuous and so on. This is another aspect of this that we're unpacking is resistance and non-consent for sterilization. So if you look at this form, and this is where the devil is in the details, what you see here is a form of someone where consent was given for sterilization. But actually consent for this sterilization was only given after the mother sued the state of California saying that the state sterilization law violated the 14th Amendment and other aspects of the U.S. Constitution, and she lost her case. So she really had no other option but to relent, and she also knew her daughter would not be released unless she agreed to the sterilization. You can also, another kind of looking at the real granular level, one of the things that you see that happens over time and allowed so many to be sterilized in California is that sterilization determinations were made even before someone was in the institution. They were made during the commitment process. Often that went through the court system, but not necessarily. So if you see here, here's someone who the form was changed for this individual so that they are someone who is or to be an inmate. So they were going to be transferred at some point to the institution, and that eventually, by the late 1930s, prompted a change in the language to give the sterilizers a broader leeway in terms of who could be designated for sterilization. So they didn't actually have to be institutionalized, but they could be caught up usually in the juvenile court system or in the legal system, or committed by a private physician and so on. There also is, we have to look at all the complications here. There are a small number of individuals in the state institutions who actually wanted sterilization, because this was a time at which we know per ACOG guidelines and other, because of other issues of availability and access, it was really hard for women, and we're talking about mainly women in this case, to get sterilized. Most of you had to be middle class. You had to have resources. You had to have a physician who was on board and willing to do the procedure. You usually had to have several children. So if someone wanted to be sterilized, they'd have to meet, all of those different bars. So as another researcher has found in the case of North Carolina, about 6% of the women sterilized there actually committed themselves because they wanted to be sterilized. And this is a similar case we found in California, where there's actually a request for sterilization. So there's where you get into some of this double-edged issues around, the reproductive justice and reproductive health access. And there you see her desired commitment. So someone who's willing to be committed to be sterilized. So our project is expanding. I mentioned before we were doing comparative work between states. So our team decided to, and we also have, I'm working with a colleague who has the North Carolina records. She's wrote a book on them and has them in her possession, all IRB approved and everything, of course. And we also have added Iowa into the mix, which is a very interesting state, an overwhelmingly white state where you can see a lot at play in terms of urban-rural distinctions and issues around disability. We're also adding Michigan into the mix. We have a supplement out to add this into our R01. I'll talk more about that at the end, but assuming we're collecting data, we're creating different Redcap instruments for these 4 different states that will be integrated and synthesized, based on what kind of analysis we want to do. But assuming we are able to, enter all the data from these 4 states, we'll have data from about 35,000 sterilizations, so more than half of those that occurred in the U.S. in the 20th century. This gives you a flavor of what this is beginning to look like. We just started this in September. We found out, yay, we actually got the funding. So we've started to do some of the analysis and the data entry. So you can see that it's interesting in California. It kind of maps onto what I was telling you about our records being covering the period 1919 to 1950. Sterilizations in California really slowed down but did not end until 1979, but they did slow down in the early 1950s. But you see in North Carolina, they actually increase in the 50s and 60s. And that's when there's increased targeting of black women. And you really begin to see that highly charged racial aspect of the state's eugenic program. And Iowa kind of bumps along, but does continue on all the way until the mid-1970s. So this is number of sterilization. This is rates of sterilization, fairly similar data. So there are a few ways in which, how can we think about this research? We know that it's informing policy in terms of the eugenic sterilization bill in California. But one of the things that it, sheds light on are what are the conditions that can give rise to this kind of sterilization abuse and reproductive injustice. We can see similar patterns at play in the early 2000s when 150 unauthorized sterilizations took place in 2 California women's prisons because of a lack of oversight, because of a denigration of the reproductive worthiness of women, mainly low-income women of color who were, imprisoned on their first offense, often a drug offense. We also can see the complexities around sterilization and long-term birth control as a condition for a shorter sentence or continued access to welfare or state support. So sterilization continues, just as it was in California, to be wielded, as a bait for someone to get a shorter sentence or to be convinced to do something vis-a-vis the criminal justice system. And we put all of this in the context of unequal access to reproductive health services and technology. So it is a social determinants of health issue, and we can see that in the past, and we can see that today. Examples of this, you may have heard of the case about 2 years ago of a Tennessee judge who promised reduced jail times if inmates agreed to vasectomies. This was shut down. A few men received vasectomies. No women were sterilized. It was shut down because there was an uproar after this happened. But a judge did it and felt like it was in the realm of his authority to do so. We can also put this work in conversation with questions around sterilization rates today. Why is it that African American and Latina women have higher rates of regret vis-a-vis sterilization? Does that have something to do with a softer or maybe not so soft coercion? How do you even understand regret? These are the kinds of questions and discussions I have with those who are doing more contemporary research on these issues. And then this ongoing, tension, and Lisa Harris, my colleague in OBGYN, has written very poignantly on this, between the need to maintain the safeguards around sterilization that were put in when after revelations about sterilization abuse came to a head in the U.S. in the 1970s. A waiting period was instituted, a 30-day waiting period around sterilizations paid for by Medicaid. Bilingual forms were required. Minors could not be sterilized. Sterilizations could not happen in federal prisons, and so on and so forth, versus viewing that really as like a patriarchal relic of the past. If women want to be sterilized, well, women should not have to. Why do they have to wait 30 days, to have, some doctor or medical authority tell them they have to wait, a month to do it when they know they want to do it next week? So that is, I wouldn't say I have an answer for that, but I think that our historical work can shed light and help us frame those very questions. So here's a few examples of those kinds of tensions. And then this relates to the sterilizations that occurred in California state prisons between at least 2006 and 2010, which we talk about in our article, and is also, that has been incorporated into the most recent eugenic sterilization compensation bill. So one question we can ask is, when does historical research prompt the redress of wrongs? So in the terms of eugenic sterilization, when we were analyzing this, we wanted to determine if what we found met the bar for meritorious redress claims. And we think it does because it meets several criteria. It was a historical injustice that occurred to a group of people, particularly an identifiable subset of individuals, not just one person in one setting. It's well documented. We have all the records. The records can be co-verified by records now held at the California State Archives. It impacted people, vulnerable populations, those ostensibly with disabilities. Remember, disability was a label, not necessarily an actual condition. People from poor backgrounds and marginalized communities. The state has already admitted that it was an injustice because the governor of California and the state senate apologized for the sterilization program in 2003. Affected individuals are capable of receiving redress, as they have in North Carolina and Virginia. And there's precedent beyond that in Germany, Canada, and most recently in Sweden, where transgender individuals, the number of them were sterilized before and as part of agreeing to gender reassignment surgery. So yet another that's a more kind of contemporary instance. So based on that, we make our strong claim for redress, which I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this actually happens, and then it will be the big kind of test of outreach to vulnerable communities and numbers of people, the numbers of which are dwindling, almost every week in terms of how many of the 20,000 who were sterilized, how many are actually alive today, how can they be located, what kind of outreach can take place, will they come forward and tell their stories, because very few actually have done so, although they have in North Carolina, Virginia, and other places. So what are the next steps in our process and our research? Well, first, we'll see how the bill plays out in California. The methods that we used in our American Journal of Public Health article are now being replicated by a researcher in the bioethics unit at the University of Utah. And I'm actually going out there next week to give a talk, and I'll get to hear about what he's been up to. In his case, actually, the state agencies are compiling the records for him. He is not allowed to see them, but they've come to an agreement where they're going to put together the numbers. Many fewer were sterilized in Utah, but the program went until pretty late in time in the 60s and 70s, so there could be a good number of people who are still alive. A member of our research team, Kate O'Connor, who is a graduate student who works with me and has run our lab for several years, is doing really path-breaking research in Michigan, which is relevant to us in this room. What she's finding is that in Michigan, overwhelmingly, those sterilized were poor white immigrants, a good number of Polish, Italian individuals based on last name, a good number of individuals who were identified as sexually transgressive or deviant, particularly young boys, and they were institutionalized in a range of homes, bigger and smaller homes and hospitals across the state, from Lapeer, which was the biggest one, to Ionia, to Traverse City, to Kalamazoo, and smaller facilities. Now, one of the things that she's uncovered in her research, which is something we could have a conversation of what to do with this information, is that, and thus far this number could change, it could be updated, over 800 people were sterilized in this very hospital as part of Michigan's eugenic sterilization program. The majority of them between about 1930 and 1945. You see some numbers here from that period. So that is like every few days, someone was sent from one of these state institutions to U of M, where, as far as we can tell, general surgery performed a vasectomy or a tubal ligation or the predecessor to that operation. What's interesting is that, and this will also ring true to many of you in this room, U of M threatened to stop doing sterilizations, not because the hospital had a moral objection, but because of cost. Because the state compensated $50 for each sterilization, but the hospital argued that each sterilization actually cost $100 to perform. So we're not sure, but it could be that's why U of M appears to have stopped performing these sterilizations by about 1945. So you'll have to wait and see, what we figure out in that regard, because this is just all very new. Having access to these records, my student and the team were the first people to ever see any of these records in the state of Michigan. But you may know that last year, a building was renamed on Central Campus, the C.C. Little building, Michigan's president from 1926 to 1929, because he was, an avid eugenicist who helped organize the Third Race Betterment Conference in Battle Creek in 1928. And so based on his writings and based on the way he kind of approached categories of elite and not so elite in the institution, through a long process, the university, with Regent's approval, decided to remove his name from the building. So what do we do with this information? I'm not quite sure, but it could prompt some reflection on the involvement of, and it's not really, the point is not to point the fingers and blame everyone, but to think about the historical context in which this could have happened and what it means for thinking about the history of bioethics in our own neck of the woods and more broadly in the larger context of the history. So I think that's all I've got for you today. I'm happy to entertain questions. I think we have about 10 plus minutes. So please feel free to ask me about anything I've addressed, or if you want to share your expertise in terms of addressing some of the questions that I've raised, I would welcome that as well. Yes. Well, I don't know much about the ones here in Michigan or at U of M Hospital. We need to do further investigation on that. But for the most part, the physicians involved were medical superintendents at state institutions. That was their primary job. They often lived in the facility, and they, saw themselves as kind of guardians of fitness and unfitness. And some of them were individuals that, it's complicated. Some of them evinced great compassion for those communities that they were taking care of. At the same time, they had very stark understandings of the worthiness of them as reproductive and productive individuals, for that matter. But they had MDs. They trained at the medical schools of the day. Often some at quite prominent medical schools, because eugenics was very supported. In the U.S., it was quite popular in the 20s and 30s. But the vast majority of them were medical superintendents who lived on site. Yeah. Yes. Oh, sorry. Why don't you and then you? What do you? Well, that did not occur in the internment camps, as far as I'm aware. And in our records, we find very few cases of, there are a few cases, but very few cases of, Japanese or Japanese Americans. We do find a good number of cases, and this is kind of a little bit of a complication when thinking about Spanish surnames, of Filipinos. There were a good number of Filipinos that came to California starting at the turn of the 20th century, worked in agriculture, and so you'll find, we haven't done an analysis of it, and the actual number might be too small. But you certainly see among the eugenicists, often a strong, anti-Japanese xenophobia, so to speak. But I'm not aware of that. It's a similar space of confinement based on ideas of security and the state. It's different in the context of war. So I would view those institutions as not that dissimilar from the homes and hospitals, but serving a more temporary, targeted purpose. But it is an interesting question, and I don't know enough. I would have to go into the federal records to see if that occurred. But thank you. And then you had a question up there. You did. Hi. Yeah, with Spanish surnames, we've done the best that we can looking at records from 1920 to 1950. The code book for Spanish surnames was produced around the 1980s, when actually, a category of Hispanic as an ethnicity was added to the U.S. Census. So once that was added, and Mexican, white, these categories had been contested in the censuses prior. But after 1980, demographers could do a lot more analysis around Hispanics vis-a-vis a range of questions in the U.S. population. And so these code books started to be produced then, and we have used those and kind of tagged all of our surnames to those to check for accuracy. There's also, in addition to your question about Japanese, which prompted me to think about Filipinos, there also were a good number of Portuguese in California who ended up in state institutions. So you have to be careful when looking at those, because those surnames can be similar. But so we rely on, kind of the state-of-the-art, demographer's guidebook. And I don't have it in front of me. Nicole knows that really well. And that's where also the collaborative effort comes in to make sure that we're doing this the right way. When it comes to actually looking at, in Michigan, let's say Italians or Poles, we're going to have to really figure out how to do that. Actually, a lot of interesting work has been spawned out of genealogical research and Ancestry.com, where, out of people's seeking their own, ancestry. And so we'll have to kind of figure out what the state of the art is around those as well. But it's a really good question. It's a challenging question. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be the best approximation we can get. Yes?
Like now there's women are kind of facing barriers to getting sterilization with that by men.
Just women, yeah.
You know why?
Well, I don't know if they're more likely to face certain barriers. And that's a very interesting question about the gender breakdown. I've thought about it mainly in the context of women. Ed, I don't know if you have any. Ed knows a lot about this too and kind of the contemporary policies. But that's something that I should think more about. It's a great question.
Yeah, the history was to redress a perceived wrong, which was the involuntary sterilization of women at the time that they gave birth. And so the law was, well, you have to wait 30 days in the hope that that would lower the involuntary sterilization rate or coerced sterilization rate. And the unfortunate side effect is women who say, look, I don't want to have any more babies. I'm having a baby right now. Now is the right time to sterilize me. I want you to do it. If you have private insurance, the answer is sure. If you have Medicare, the answer is don't have to wait 30 days. So, in an attempt to redress one rule, we create another issue.
So like, why not? Men don't, whereas men were obviously.
Well, and then one thing I didn't have a chance to really go into in terms of the development of these, protections or barriers, however we want to categorize them, is that really emerged in the 70s in the context of involuntary sterilizations of Mexican women, African American women, Native American women under the whole Johnson, administration kind of expansion of family planning. It was like the worst of all worlds, where on the one hand there was more money going into family planning, good, more reproductive services, good, but still within a kind of a eugenic, kind of racist, to put it bluntly, framework, so that you had people like, the Ralph sisters, who where two minors were sterilized against their will. The mother then, filed suit with the Southern Poverty Law Center. That was one of many high-profile cases. So that's actually, those cases are the cases that led to these new stipulations and kind of, ethical protocols, not the history that I have looked at, which raises questions, too, of how does that reconfigure the way that we think about, coercion and consent. Oh, there is a movie about that called No Mas Bebés, which I know some folks in the bioethics section have seen with Katie, has shown it to them. But if you're interested in that, I have a copy and can share it with you. It goes through that in great depth, and you meet some of the survivors. Yes, well, you, in the very back, you had a question.
You see a more insidious and not in like nationalists. I think more of people in low income or folks like even public health of overpopulation in the global south or the developing world, as opposed to overconsumption in the western. Right? I was just wondering if your research or your work delved into or across those more ways in which
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you can see, and thank you for that comment, is that, the rationale for eugenic sterilization, like under this eugenic sterilization laws, actually began to shift in the United States in the 40s, 50s, certainly by the 1960s, to a rationale that was based on rudimentary understandings of like a bad genetic unit character, right? So these really there's dominant genes and then the recessive genes that jump, and there's a gene for feeble-mindedness. By the 40s, everyone knew that that was really sloppy and that, scientifically that couldn't hold any water. At the same time that that's going on, these programs continue, and their biases come out even more full force because the language, the rationales become increasingly those of this person is not fit to be a parent. This type of person is having too many children. So you can see a connection between, particularly, let's take the case of North Carolina, sterilizations of African American women in North Carolina in the 50s and 60s, the language that's being used, the language around overpopulation, the language of welfare, and very much a connection to what the same agencies that are supporting that are supporting the programs that are going on in India, where certain quotas of sterilization have to be met, and also in Puerto Rico, where they're experimenting with certain types of contraception and other forms of longer-acting birth control. And I would say no. I mean, it's sad. We have not moved that far, despite, understandings of social determinants of health, despite understandings of inequity and equality. We're just, particularly at this moment, those ideas are very persistent, and they're not that far under the surface even of what sometimes more, liberal even seeming causes or interpretations. So, yeah, it's an intractable situation. And I hope that the history can shed some light on that. It's not going to tell us what is happening today is not a repetition, but it might shed light on patterns that are happening today. Are there any questions from this side of the... Yes?
Your research hadn't been looked at before, and it was tough to recruit. But in doing that, did you?
Well, I would say that, in terms of California, it hasn't been so much resistance as ineptitude, which is part of the story that, these records were sitting in a file cabinet that no one cared about. They actually lost the records for a while, and that's a whole other issue I don't have time to talk about. But just as these were marginalized people who have forgotten institutions, the records have not been cared for. And there are many patient records that are lost. There are patient records in institutions across the country, many of which have closed and been razed. Like, think of the Northville Hospital. That was just razed like 3 months ago. Many records are down in the basements or the tunnels of these institutions, and we'll never get, as a historian, it makes me very sad that I'll never get a chance to see those. In some states, there has been resistance, like in Oregon, when this was coming to light, the agency in charge of those records decided to shred all of them because it didn't want, that aspect of the history to be known, and it used some state, something on the books, some rule on the books to be able to do that. So, really, there are barriers. Like in Iowa, we cannot digitize or copy any of the records. So my collaborator who's working in the Iowa State Archives, she has a team of 20 students that she takes into the archives, and they are putting everything in Redcap. Everything is HIPAA, IRB, totally protected. Nothing, the only thing that's going out are their laptops with the data entry in a protected way. Michigan, they're much more open. They're, letting her digitize those records as long as they are redacted and used according. So one could say I would say that's responsible use of records, but it does raise the issue, if you want to recognize people as historical actors, should you erase their names? That's another issue. Yes?
Lots of states use things like always illegal or always HIPAA, but in fact, HIPAA says that the records are only 50 years, they're not HIPAA protected anymore.
But the states can sometimes will expand on that. So California has a 75-year rule for the records. So if they're 75 years or older, you don't have to redact them. So sometimes they expand on that. Yeah, I mean, if everyone just followed actually HIPAA, it would make this a lot easier. Yeah. Yes?
You talked about how one of your
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this work informs or contributes to broader nascent conversation about reparations for.
Well, I would say that, this was something that is very important whenever you have an article like this in like a high-profile journal, is you have to get media coverage. So we did have a lot of media coverage for this, which then seeped into the political, legislative arena and got some support. It also echoed around other issues in California, like reparations for people who have been deported. Going back to the Japanese internment example, reparations that was on the federal level for Japanese internees. There are other instances of reparations or compensation for those who were involved in human experimentation, or we can think about Tuskegee, which was more of a lawsuit. But in any case, I would say overall, we want to, on the one hand, really stick to our particular case, which is what we know best and where we can weigh the evidence. However, I do think we can use this to raise questions about when does something become a meritorious claim. Are the criteria being met? There are discussions going on right now in Democratic, kind of primary for the next election about reparations for slavery. So I don't know how much we can draw from this. I mean, I know the literature, secondary literature, and the good literature to go to think about it. According to that, slavery in terms of its brutality and its, how systemic it was, would meet many of the criteria. But then you get many generations hence. So what does that actually look like? This is a case where it would be a compensation for a living individual of particular said wrong. So, but I think lining all of those things up and understanding how they relate to each other can be beneficial, and also thinking about, reflecting on hard reflections on medicine and the ways in which, medicine has done people wrong, even by actors who thought they were acting, acting in the name of compassion. Yes?
Given the attention that's been work, have some of the teachers been heard? Have people come forward and start talking about their experience?
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing challenge in that because the California sterilizations that we've studied really ended by the 1950s, I actually have only met one survivor of the state's program. He died several years ago. I have met many relatives who are interested, and I've met friends of folks who were institutionalized. I have met about 5 women who were sterilized in the state prisons in the later period. But in North Carolina, and Virginia, people who were sterilized came forward and told their stories in powerful ways. And that's been one of the kind of challenges of doing this work, is we haven't had those voices and that kind of storytelling. But it still might happen. So I am holding out hope for that.
So we're at your time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all.